In this tutorial, you're going to learn about optimizing your materials that use SRS so you can increase performance on all devices. The main element for this is this second to last category, feature control. This category has tons of Boolean switches in both opaque and translucent materials, and it can be used to disable features that your materials don't need in order to save on performance. Right now, everything is enabled, save for this cheap mode, which we'll get into later. And with everything enabled, this material will logically have a higher complexity and take a larger toll on your performance. So let's quickly take a look at what features we're actually using in this material and then disable everything that we're not using. The first thing that comes to mind are patterns. This material does not use any patterns, it only uses gradients, so let's disable the patterns. Under the patterns and the gradient control, you can also select if you're using the patterns only on shadows or only on highlights, but since none of these places are using patterns, we can just disable it for all effects. Now this already saves a bit on complexity, but we can go even further. Let's take a look at the gradients. Now on the shadow, there's a gradient. On the highlight, there's also a gradient, but the rim light doesn't have a gradient, so let's disable the gradient for the rim light. Since we're also not using any pattern backgrounds, we can disable pattern backgrounds. Now, in this material right here, there's nothing that dynamically switches between metallic and non-metallic. We're not using any maps, we're not using any complicated functions that switch between that. It's simply solid metallic, so what we can do is we can disable the dynamic metallic switching. And now, make sure that use metallic is set to true, so it's still metallic. If this was set to false, it would force the non-metallic shading. But this material is supposed to be metallic, so let's keep metallic. In this case right here, we're also not using the anisotropic highlight, so we can simply disable that. And with this, we've already saved a ton on performance. Let's quickly compare. On the left, you can see the unmodified material with everything enabled. On the right, we disabled everything we didn't need. Disabling all those features drastically decreased the shader complexity, and thus will also have a big improvement effect on your performance. But we could go even further. Let's say you're not using the tint actor to tint your object. Then you can just disable the tint. You're also not using the daytime controls. Then disable the daytime controls. So the same goes for the shadow manager controls and for the normal maps. But in this case, we're using the normal maps, and the shadow manager controls might also come in very handy if we're going to use this on a armor for a character, for example. So let's keep those enabled. Now with this, we've pretty much configured the feature control for this material. Now sure, there are some more things we could do. For example, if on any instance of this material we were to set the rim light size to 0, then we could go ahead and disable the rim lights. They don't need to get calculated if you can't see them. The same goes for the highlights and the shadows as well. But in this case, you can still see all of them, so let's keep them enabled. Now there's one more thing to consider. Let's say you didn't want to use metallic on this material, and you disable the use metallic. Now you'd think metallic was completely disabled, but there's still one feature that manages to sneak its way in, which is this metallic color modulation strength, which still depends on this metallic parameter right here. To disable this metallic color modulation, simply set this to 0, and it will 100% look non-metallic. There's one last thing to know about this feature control category, which is that there's this force cheap mode option right here. If you're, for example, doing visual effects and there are small pebbles flying around, or there are small dust clouds that are only visible for a brief amount of time, you don't need to have them be very expensive. So you could simply enable force cheap mode, and what this does is it gets rid of everything that's gradient related, everything that's pattern related. It just gives you the bare minimum you need for cel shading, meaning no metallic, no nothing. But this has the effect that it becomes super cheap, and you're not going to have to worry that anything that has cheap mode enabled will noticeably impact your performance. For demonstration, this right now was the first material with everything enabled. This was after we disabled everything we didn't need, and this here is the material in cheap mode. When it comes to improving performance, there are two more things you should know. Firstly is this outlines actor. Every outline type that you add will have a slight effect on performance. While this impact is very small, the more you will add, the more noticeable this impact will become. So try to keep the number of outline types to a minimum, and only use as few as you absolutely need. In order to improve it even more, you could potentially even limit the outlines to bounds and only put those bounds around objects that have those outlines. But that should be seen as a last effort, and you should only really do this if you need every single bit of performance. Now there's one last thing that you should know if you're using the Shadow Manager component and you did not follow the setup instructions mentioned in the relevant tutorial. If you're not using the Shadow Manager with multiple directional lights, you may have noticed that everything is working despite you not following the setup. While visually this is correct, internally, every Shadow Manager you have in your scene now has to find the directional light in your scene itself, instead of the tint actor doing it once for all of your Shadow Manager components. If you're using the Shadow Manager in a lot of actors, this will have a noticeable impact when you're starting your game.